He kicked his mother into a nursing home, unaware she owned the entire building. A bitter son thought he was dumping a burden, sending his frail mother away for good. But when he steps inside, the world flips upside down. She isn't just another resident. She's the one who built this place, and everyone here treats her like royalty. And as shocking truths unfold, the son realizes her greatest treasure isn't money at all, but something he's been running from his whole life. Now he's trapped between pride, greed, and the one thing he swore he didn't need: love. Will this son finally see the truth before it's too late, or lose everything that truly matters? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Richard Warren hunched over his kitchen table, his morning coffee forgotten as he shuffled through the stack of bills. The numbers blurred together, each one larger than the last. Mortgage, car payment, business loan interest, medical expenses for his mother. The columns of figures marched relentlessly down the page, a parade of financial obligations he could barely meet. "Damn it," he muttered, running a hand through his thinning hair. His construction supply business had been struggling for months now, orders dwindling as the economy tightened. The weight of it all pressed down on his shoulders like concrete. Eleanor Warren moved quietly around the kitchen behind him, her slippered feet making soft shuffling sounds on the linoleum. The scent of toast wafted through the air as she approached the table. "Here you are, Richard." She placed a plate with golden brown toast before him, her smile gentle. "You need to eat something." Richard barely glanced up. "I'm not hungry, just a few bites." Eleanor lowered herself into the chair opposite him, her movements careful and measured. At 78, her body had grown frail, but her eyes remained clear and kind. "The Lord provides, Richard. Remember how your father always said, 'I don't need a sermon with breakfast, Mother.'" Richard slapped the electric bill down on the table. "What I need is a way to pay all this." Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. "I know things are difficult right now, but worry never emptied tomorrow of its troubles. It only empties today of its strength." Richard's jaw tightened. Another platitude, another piece of wisdom from his saintly mother who never seemed to understand the real world. His father had been gone for 5 years now, and Richard had been stuck with Eleanor ever since. The constant reminders of faith, the quiet humming of hymns, the Bible always open on the side table, it all grated on him like sandpaper. "Trust in the Lord's provision, Richard. He knows what you need." "What I need," Richard said, his voice rising, "is for my business not to fail. What I need is to not have all these extra expenses." He gestured vaguely in her direction. "What I need is some peace and quiet without someone hovering over me constantly." The words hung in the air between them. Eleanor's face showed no anger, only a momentary flash of hurt quickly replaced by that maddening patience. "I'm sorry you feel that way." She reached across the table, her veined hand stopping short of touching his. "I only want to help." "Well, you're not helping." Richard pushed back from the table, chair legs scraping against the floor. "I can't keep living like this." Eleanor withdrew her hand, nodding slightly. "I understand," but she didn't understand. How could she? She never had to struggle like this, never had to worry about keeping a business afloat. His father had left her comfortable, while Richard had spent years fighting for every scrap of success. Without another word, Eleanor rose from the table. She gathered his untouched plate and carried it to the sink. The water ran, and she began washing the morning dishes. Richard watched her from behind, noticed how her shoulders curved forward now, how her once straight back had begun to bow. Her hands moved methodically in the soapy water, spotted with age but still capable. Those hands had once tucked him in, had wiped away his childhood tears, had clapped the loudest at his high school graduation. Something twisted in his chest, but he pushed it away. He couldn't afford sentiment. Not now, not with everything falling apart around him. As Eleanor's fingers worked over the breakfast plates, Richard felt the bitterness crystallize inside him. He needed a solution. He needed freedom. He needed her gone. The bell above the hardware store door jingled as Richard entered. He nodded at the cashier and headed straight to the back where Carl stood organizing boxes of screws. "You look like hell," Carl said without looking up. Richard leaned against the counter. "Thanks for noticing." Carl glanced at him, then set down his inventory clipboard. "Seriously, man, what's eating you?" "Everything." Richard grabbed a handful of washers from a nearby bin, letting them slide through his fingers. Business is down again this month. I've got suppliers breathing down my neck. And my mother. Eleanor giving you trouble? Richard dropped the washers back into the bin with a metallic clatter. Not exactly trouble. She's just there, all the time, with her prayers and her little sayings and her disappointment. Carl crossed his arms. Disappointment? She doesn't say it, but I know she thinks I'm failing. Richard's voice dropped. And maybe I am. Dad would have figured a way out of this mess by now. Your dad didn't have to support his elderly mother. That's just it. Richard lowered his voice, though no customers were nearby. It's like having a child again, but worse. The medications, the doctor visits, the special foods, and I can't even have a moment's peace in my own house without her hovering, asking if I'm okay, if I need anything. Carl snorted. Sounds terrible. Someone caring about you. You don't get it. Richard ran a hand through his hair. She's a burden, Carl. I hate saying it, but it's true. I can't focus on saving my business when I'm worried about her falling in the shower or forgetting to turn off the stove. Carl studied Richard for a moment, then turned back to his inventory. So do what everyone else does. Put her in a nice home. The words hung in the air between them. Richard had considered it before fleetingly, guiltily, but hearing it spoken aloud made it suddenly real. A nursing home? The words felt strange in his mouth. They call them assisted living facilities now. Carl shrugged. My cousin put his dad in one last year. Says it's the best decision he ever made. Guy's got nurses, activities, people his own age to talk to, and my cousin got his life back. Richard frowned. I don't know. Look, Carl said, his voice matter of fact. You're killing yourself trying to be everything to everyone. Your business is tanking, and you're not equipped to be a caretaker. Those places have trained staff. It's their job. She'd hate it. Would she? Or is that just what you think? Carl leaned closer. These places aren't what they used to be. They've got gardens and movie nights and bingo. Hell, it might be exactly what she needs other old folks to pray with. Richard stared at the floor, considering it's the responsible choice, Richard, for both of you. The drive home stretched longer than usual. Richard gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white as Carl's words echoed in his mind. A nice home, trained staff, the responsible choice. He pictured Eleanor in a place with gardens and bingo, surrounded by people her own age. No more worrying about her falling, no more interrupted work calls, no more gentle reminders about faith and provision when all he wanted was silence. The guilt bubbled up, but he pushed it down. This wasn't about getting rid of her. This was about what was best for both of them. She needed proper care. He needed space to save his business. A nursing home? No. An assisted living facility wasn't abandonment. It was a solution. The responsible solution. By the time Richard pulled into his driveway, the seed Carl had planted had taken root. His mother would understand eventually. She always did. It was the right thing to do. For both of them. The afternoon sun filtered through the oak trees, casting dappled shadows across Eleanor's garden. She knelt beside her prized roses, pruning shears in her weathered hands. The rich scent of earth and blossoms surrounded her as she carefully trimmed away dead branches, humming an old hymn under her breath. This small patch of earth had become her sanctuary over the years. Among the flowers, she found peace that eluded her inside the house where tension with Richard hung like a heavy curtain. Mom, you out here? Eleanor looked up, shielding her eyes from the sunday. Richard stood at the garden's edge, his posture stiff despite the casual smile fixed on his face. Just giving these roses some attention, she said, setting down her shears. Your father always said a neglected garden is like a forgotten prayer. Richard nodded absently, his gaze darting around the yard. Need any help? Eleanor couldn't remember the last time he'd offered to help in the garden. No, thank you, dear. I'm nearly finished. He shuffled closer, hands in his pockets. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something. She patted the bench beside her. Come sit with me. Richard remained standing. I've been thinking. He started, his voice unnaturally bright. You are here alone most days while I'm working. And those stairs in the house, they can't be easy on your knees. Eleanor tilted her head, waiting. I found this place, he continued, pulling a glossy brochure from his back pocket. Sunnyside Assisted Living. It's really nice gardens, much bigger than this one. Activities every day. People your own age to talk to. The weight of his words settled on Eleanor's shoulders. She looked down at her soil-stained hands. A nursing home, she said quietly. Assisted living facility? Richard corrected quickly. It's different. More independence, better care than I can give you. You'd have your own apartment, but nurses will be there if you needed help. Eleanor's chest tightened. She'd known this conversation was coming, had felt it in the growing distance between them, in the impatient sighs and averted gazes. Still, hearing the words spoken aloud pierced deeper than she'd anticipated. I see, she managed. Look at the pictures, Richard urged, thrusting the brochure toward her. They have a chapel, book clubs, even a gardening program. You could teach them a thing or two about roses. Eleanor took the brochure with trembling fingers, not really seeing the smiling faces on its cover. Would this make you happy, Richard? She asked softly. He blinked, caught off guard by the directness of her question. This isn't about me. It's about what's best for you. Of course, she said, folding the brochure carefully. When would you like me to go? Richard shifted his weight. I've scheduled a tour for tomorrow. If you like it, they have a room available next week. Next week? So soon? Eleanor nodded, her eyes fixed on the roses she lovingly tended for decades. I'll need to pack then. I'll help, Richard offered, relief evident in his voice. You won't need much. The rooms come furnished. That night, Eleanor knelt beside her bed, her nightgown pulling around her. The house was quiet. Richard had gone out after dinner, unable to bear the silence that had fallen between them. Dear Lord, she whispered, clasping her hands together. I don't understand your plan right now, but I trust you. Please watch over my son. His heart has hardened, but I know the goodness is still there. Help him find his way back to compassion, Lord, and give me strength for whatever lies ahead. A tear slipped down her cheek as she added, and if this nursing home is where you need me to be, show me the purpose in it. Amen. Morning light spilled through the curtains as Eleanor carefully folded her best cardigan and placed it in the small leather suitcase open on her bed. She'd been up since dawn, sorting through a lifetime of belongings to decide what deserved space in the single bag Richard had provided. Just the essentials, Mom, he'd said last night. They don't have much storage space in those rooms. She ran her fingers along the worn spines of books on her bedside table, pausing at the faded blue Bible that had belonged to her husband. The leather was cracked at the corners, pages yellowed from decades of daily reading. Eleanor lifted it reverently, opening to the inscription written in her husband's steady hand. To my beloved Eleanor, may God's words light our path together. She pressed the Bible to her chest for a moment before tucking it between layers of clothing. A sharp knock rattled her door. Mom, are you ready yet? We need to get going. Eleanor closed the suitcase. Just about finished, dear. The appointment's at 10. We don't want to be late. Richard's footsteps retreated down the hallway. Eleanor glanced around the bedroom that had been her sanctuary for 30 years. The familiar flowered wallpaper, the quilt she'd made when Richard was born, the window that framed her view of the garden. She touched each item gently, saying goodbye without words. From her dresser, she took a small framed photograph. Richard as a boy, grinning widely with his father's arm around his shoulders. She slipped it into her purse before picking up her suitcase. Richard waited by the front door, car keys jangling in his hand. Is that everything? Yes, Eleanor said. This is all I need. His eyes flicked to the small suitcase. Good, traveling light. Outside, the spring air carried the scent of blooming dogwoods. Eleanor paused on the porch steps, drinking in the view of her neighborhood one last time. Mom, the car's running. She nodded and made her way down the path. Richard took her suitcase and tossed it in the trunk, then opened the passenger door with an exaggerated flourish. Your chariot awaits. Eleanor settled into the seat, arranging her skirt around her knees. Thank you, Richard. The drive passed in silence. Eleanor watched familiar streets give way to parts of town she rarely visited. After 15 minutes, they turned onto a tree-lined avenue where a large brick building stood surrounded by carefully manicured gardens. Here we are, Richard announced, pulling into a parking space. Sunnyside Assisted Living. What did I tell you? Looks nice, right? Eleanor studied the building. Warm light shone through large windows. On a wide front porch, Several elderly residents sat in rocking chairs, chatting and laughing. Staff members in blue uniforms moved purposefully between them, offering drinks and adjusting blankets. Yes, she said softly. It does look nice. Richard grabbed her suitcase from the trunk and strolled toward the entrance. Eleanor followed more slowly, her eyes taking in every detail of the grounds. A stone path wound through flower beds bursting with spring colors. A fountain bubbled cheerfully in a small courtyard where two older gentlemen played chess. As they approached the main doors, a tall woman in a tailored suit stepped out to greet them. Good morning. You must be the Warrens. We've been expecting you. Eleanor smiled, a gentle curve of her lips that held a hint of something Richard couldn't quite identify. Was it resignation? Acceptance? No, it almost looked like recognition, as though she'd come to a familiar place rather than somewhere new and strange. Yes, Eleanor said, extending her hand to the woman. I'm Eleanor Warren. It's lovely to be here. The director led them through oak-paneled doors into a bright lobby where sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows. Eleanor moved with unhurried grace, taking in the tasteful furnishings, fresh flowers, and artwork adorning the walls. Right this way to reception, the director said, guiding them to a curved desk where a young woman looked up with a practiced smile that suddenly transformed into genuine warmth. Mrs. Warren, the receptionist stood, smoothing her skirt. It's so wonderful to finally meet you in person. Richard shifted his weight, glancing between the receptionist and his mother. Eleanor simply nodded, her smile gentle. This is my son, Richard, Eleanor said. Of course. Welcome, Mr. Warren. The receptionist's tone cooled several degrees. We have everything prepared for Mrs. Warren's stay with us. The director placed a hand lightly on Eleanor's arm. Mrs. Warren, would you like a cup of tea before we start the paperwork? Chef Thomas mentioned he made those lemon cookies you mentioned during our phone consultation. That would be lovely. Thank you. Eleanor's voice held the same quiet dignity it always did. Richard frowned. Phone consultation? Mom, you talked with them before? Just to discuss a few preferences, Eleanor said vaguely. A staff member appeared with a silver tea service and a plate of delicate cookies. Richard watched, bemused, as the young man set it down with the care usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. Mrs. Warren, we've prepared the East Suite for you, the director said. It has the garden view you requested. The East Suite? Richard interjected. I thought we discussed a standard room. That sounds expensive. The director and Eleanor exchanged a look that Richard couldn't interpret. Everything has been arranged, the director assured him. Now, shall we proceed with the admission paperwork? They settled at a small conference table where the director placed a leather portfolio before Eleanor. Richard pulled his chair closer, prepared to help his mother navigate the complicated forms he expected. These are the standard admission documents, the director explained, opening the portfolio. Mrs. Warren, if you could review and sign where indicated. Eleanor adjusted her reading glasses and began examining the papers with careful attention. Richard leaned forward, scanning for pricing information. Mom, let me check the payment terms, he said, reaching for the forms. The director subtly shifted the portfolio away from his grasp. Mrs. Warren is quite familiar with our documentation. Eleanor turned the page, reading thoroughly before signing her name with a steady hand. Richard noticed the director watching his mother with an expression that bordered on deference. A staff member appeared at the door. Excuse me, Director Simmons? The board members have arrived for their monthly meeting. Should I tell them, Mrs.? Warren will be joining shortly. Or would she prefer to settle in first? The director glanced at Eleanor, waiting for a response rather than answering herself. Please tell them I'll be there after I've completed these formalities, Eleanor replied without looking up from the papers. Richard's eyebrows shot upward. Board members? What meeting? Just a resident welcome committee, the director said smoothly. But her eyes darted away too quickly. Eleanor continued signing documents, turning pages with the confidence of someone reviewing familiar territory. When she reached the final page, she passed the portfolio back to the director, who accepted it with a slight bow of her head. Everything appears to be in order, Eleanor said. Richard stared at his mother, suspicion blooming in his mind. Something wasn't adding up. The deferential treatment, the East Suite, board meetings, these weren't the normal courtesies extended to new nursing home residents. His frown deepened as he watched the director treat his frail, supposedly helpless mother like someone who mattered, someone with authority. Richard paced the polished hallway, checking his watch for the third time in 10 minutes. He left Eleanor to settle in while he went to move the car, but his real purpose was reconnaissance. Something strange was happening here, and he intended to find out what. The nursing home didn't match his expectations. No medicinal smell, no depressing atmosphere. Instead, sunlight poured through windows that overlooked manicured gardens. Artwork that looked too expensive for a care facility hung on walls painted in warm, cheerful colors. He approached the nurse's station, where two women in crisp uniforms chatted while reviewing charts. "Excuse me, I'm looking for my mother's room." "Eleanor Warren?" The nurses exchanged glances. "Mrs. Warren is in the garden pavilion," the older nurse said. "Would you like me to show you?" "I'll find it," Richard replied. "Which way?" He followed her directions, his footsteps echoing on the marble floors. A marble-floored nursing home? His unease deepened. Through glass doors, he spotted his mother seated at an iron table beneath a pergola draped with wisteria. Three nurses surrounded her, laughing at something she'd said. One held a clipboard. Richard hung back, watching. "Mrs. Warren, the music program you suggested has been wonderful," said a nurse with graying hair. "Mr. Fillmore actually spoke yesterday during the violin quartet. First words in months." Eleanor nodded. "Music reaches places in our hearts that words cannot." "And thank you for approving my scholarship," said a younger nurse. "Nursing school would have been impossible otherwise." "You earned it, Angela." Eleanor patted the girl's hand. "Your dedication to our residents deserves recognition." "Our residents?" Richard's stomach tightened. "The new memory care wing, will you cut the ribbon at the opening next month?" asked the third nurse. "I'd be honored," Eleanor said. Richard backed away, nearly colliding with an orderly pushing a medication cart. "Sorry, sir," the young man said. "Are you looking for someone?" "The director," Richard replied. Immediately, 5 minutes later, Richard stood in the director's office, arms crossed. The nameplate on the desk read, "Sarah Simmons, Executive Director." "Mr. Warren, what seems to be troubling you?" Director Simmons gestured to a chair. Richard remained standing. "What's going on here? My mother's been here 3 hours, and people are treating her like she matters?" Simmons supplied. "Like she owns the place," Richard snapped. Simmons leaned back in her chair, studying him. "Mr. Warren, when you contacted us about a placement for your mother, we assumed you knew." "Knew what?" "Your mother has been our most dedicated board member for 15 years. Her investment made our recent expansion possible. The East Wing bears her late husband's name." Richard's mouth went dry. "Investment?" "Substantial investment," Simmons clarified. "After your father passed, she used most of her inheritance to establish this place, not as a business venture, but as a mission." The room seemed to tilt. Richard gripped the back of the chair for support. "That's impossible. My mother doesn't have that kind of money." Director Simmons opened the drawer and removed a framed photograph. She handed it to Richard. The image showed a younger Eleanor cutting a ribbon before the very building they stood in. The plaque beside her read, "Warren Senior Living Center." "Mr. Warren, your mother owns this entire facility." Director Simmons spoke gently, as though breaking difficult news. She always said she wanted to create a place where every senior feels valued, even when their families forget their worth. The photograph trembled in Richard's hands as 15 years of misconceptions crumbled around him. Richard found Eleanor arranging framed photographs on her dresser. The room, spacious and flooded with afternoon light, looked nothing like the sterile cell he'd imagined when dropping her off. Fresh flowers sat in a crystal vase. A handmade quilt draped across a comfortable-looking armchair. She looked up when he entered, her smile fading at his expression. "You own this place." The words fell between them like stones. Eleanor placed the last frame, a picture of Richard's graduation, carefully beside the others. "I helped create it, yes. All these years," Richard's voice caught. "All these years living in my house, using my electricity, eating my food, when you had money, when you owned an entire building." "Please sit down, Richard." Eleanor gestured to the armchair. He remained standing, arms crossed. "Why didn't you tell me? Would it have mattered?" Eleanor's voice carried no accusation, only gentle inquiry. "You never asked about the money from your father's life insurance or his pension?" "Because I assumed there wasn't much." Richard paced the room. "Dad was a school principal. not a millionaire. Eleanor smoothed her skirt. Your father was prudent with money. When he passed, I received enough to live comfortably. But what good is comfort when so many suffer? She moved to the window, gazing at the gardens where residents walked slowly along paved paths. I met Sarah Director Simmons at church. She shared her dream of creating a place where seniors could live with dignity, not warehoused and forgotten. Eleanor turned to face him. I had the means to help make that dream reality. So you invested everything? Richard struggled to keep the accusation from his voice. Not everything. Enough. Her eyes carried the quiet conviction that had always irritated him. I've never needed much, Richard. Your father taught me that possessions don't bring happiness. You could have helped me with my business, with the house payments, with anything. You never asked for help, Eleanor said softly. Your pride wouldn't allow it. Besides, you needed to build something of your own, not rely on inherited wealth. Richard laughed bitterly. That's convenient. Keep the money for yourself while watching me struggle. This place isn't about money. Eleanor's voice remained steady. It's about purpose. Every resident here has a story, Richard. Every one of them deserves kindness in their final chapter. And what about my chapter? Your own son? You have your whole life ahead of you. These people, she gestured toward the hallway where residents' voices drifted in, are in their final seasons. Many have been abandoned by families too busy to remember them. Richard stared at his mother. This small woman he'd always viewed as fragile and dependent. Now he saw something else, a shrewd investor, a woman with means, a fortune he'd never known about. How much is this place worth? The question slipped out before he could stop it. Eleanor's face fell. Is that what matters to you? I deserve to know. The building and grounds? Several million, I suppose, but its true value can't be measured in dollars. Richard's hands clenched into fists. Several million. The words echoed in his mind, drowning out everything else. His struggling business, his mortgage payments, his credit card debt, all while his mother secretly controlled millions. You should have told me, he said through gritted teeth. Eleanor reached for his hand, but he pulled away. Richard, love is the only inheritance worth having. But Richard couldn't hear her wisdom over the roaring in his ears, the sound of opportunity, of financial salvation, of a fortune his mother had kept hidden while watching him drown. Richard drove home with his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The golden sunset gave way to purple dusk as the nursing home disappeared in his rearview mirror. His mother's words kept replaying in his mind. Several million. The enormity of the revelation crashed over him in waves. All those years of penny pinching, of worrying about next month's mortgage payment, of declining invitations because he couldn't afford to eat out while his mother quietly sat on a fortune. Unbelievable, he muttered, swerving around a slow-moving car. His phone rang. The caller ID showed Eleanor's name. She'd probably realized how upset he was. Richard jabbed the ignore button and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. Traffic slowed to a crawl as he approached the interstate. Richard drummed his fingers against the dashboard, his thoughts racing faster than the stalled cars around him. What else didn't he know about his mother? The woman he'd thought was a simple widow, dependent on his charity, was actually a property owner and businesswoman. Had his father known about these plans, or had she made these decisions after his death, redirecting what should have been Richard's inheritance? My inheritance, he whispered, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. The traffic inched forward. Richard's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced down to see Eleanor's name again. Please call me when you get home, dear. I'd like to explain more about the facility's mission. As if giving away his future was some noble calling. As if watching other families benefit from what should have been his wasn't a betrayal. By the time Richard pulled into his driveway, night had fallen completely. The house, his house, that he'd allowed his mother to live in out of what he thought was generosity, stood dark and empty. Without Eleanor there to turn on the porch light or prepare dinner, it felt hollow. Richard slammed the car door and stalked inside, flipping on lights as he went. In the kitchen, breakfast dishes still sat in the drying rack. Eleanor's coffee mug with its faded flowers, the plate she'd used for her toast. He'd been so eager to get her out this morning. His stomach growled, but the thought of food made him nauseous. Instead, he grabbed a beer from the refrigerator and dropped heavily onto the couch. On the mantel, family photos stared back at him, his parents' wedding day, his high school graduation, fishing trips with his father, happy moments frozen in time, before life had become a constant struggle against debt and disappointment. Richard took a long swallow of beer and pulled out his phone. 3 missed calls from Eleanor. He ignored them and opened his banking app instead. The numbers glowed mockingly from the screen. Checking account nearly empty. Savings account a joke. Credit card maxed out. And all this time, his mother had been quietly managing millions. I won't let her give it all away, he muttered, the beer bottle dangling between his fingers. That money should be mine, will be mine. Outside, a car door slammed. Richard tensed, expecting Eleanor to have somehow made her way home. But it was just his neighbor returning from work. Richard set the empty bottle down with a decisive thud. Tomorrow, he'd call his lawyer friend. There had to be a way to protect what should rightfully come to him. His mother might own the building now, but he wouldn't let her donate everything to strangers when she could be helping her own son. She can play Saint Eleanor all she wants, he whispered into the darkness of his empty house. But I won't let her give away my future. Richard parked his car in the nursing home lot the next morning, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel before shutting off the engine. He dressed in a button-down shirt and slacks, as if preparing for a business meeting rather than visiting his mother. In many ways, that's exactly what this was reconnaissance. He checked his reflection in the rearview mirror, smoothing back his thinning hair and practicing a warm smile that didn't reach his eyes. The plan was simple. Show interest, ask questions, and find out exactly how much of his potential inheritance Eleanor planned to squander. The automatic door slid open with a soft hiss. Inside, the lobby bustled with morning activity, an elderly man in a wheelchair being pushed toward the garden, a physical therapist guiding a woman with a walker, visitors signing in at the front desk. Mr. Warren, the receptionist beamed. Your mother will be thrilled you are back so soon. She's in the community room for morning activities. Richard nodded, his practiced smile fixed in place. Thank you. I thought I'd surprise her. He wandered down the hallway, noting the quality of the furnishings. Not extravagant, but certainly well maintained. Fresh flowers sat on polished side tables. Artwork, not cheap prints, but original paintings hung on walls painted in warm, cheerful colors. Eleanor's money at work, laughter spilled from the community room. Richard paused at the doorway, scanning the gathered residents, until he spotted his mother. Eleanor sat at a round table with 4 other seniors, her hands moving as she helped an ancient-looking man with trembling fingers string wooden beads. Richard! Eleanor looked up, her face lighting with genuine pleasure. What a wonderful surprise. Thought I'd check how you're settling in. He crossed the room, bending to kiss her cheek, aware of curious glances from the other residents. Everyone, this is my son. Pride filled her voice. Richard, these are my new friends, Margaret, Harold, Rose, and Frank. Richard shook hands, making small talk, while observing how the staff deferred to Eleanor. When she mentioned needing more yarn for a resident's knitting project, a young aide hurried off immediately to find some. Mother, could I steal you for a coffee? Richard gestured toward the small cafe area visible through glass doors. Eleanor excused herself from the group, patting Frank's gnarled hand. I'll be back to finish those necklaces. In the cafe, Richard put out a chair for his mother and ordered 2 coffees from a teenage girl who called Eleanor by name. You seem right at home already, he remarked, stirring sugar into his cup. The Lord works in wonderful ways. Eleanor's eyes crinkled. What was meant to separate us has only expanded my family. Richard swallowed his irritation with a sip of scalding coffee. Everyone certainly knows who you are. I've been involved with this place for years, though usually behind the scenes. She reached across to touch his hand. I'm glad you came back. I was worried after you left so abruptly yesterday. Just processing everything, he said carefully. It's not every day you learn your mother is a secret philanthropist. 2 nurses walked past their table, deep in conversation. Mrs. Warren approved the final plans yesterday, the younger one said. Construction starts next month on the new charity wing. Thank goodness, replied the older nurse. We've had to turn away so many families who can't afford care. She's doubling the number of subsidized beds. Richard's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. The contractors estimate $6 million for the expansion. The first nurse continued as they moved beyond earshot. Eleanor hadn't noticed the conversation, busy stirring honey into her tea. But Richard's jaw tightened. $6 million. Gone. His inheritance disappearing brick by brick into a wing for strangers who couldn't pay their own way. More sugar, dear? Eleanor asked, noticing his expression. No, Richard said, forcing his voice to remain steady despite the panic rising in his chest. It's plenty sweet already. Richard followed Eleanor throughout the afternoon, maintaining what he hoped appeared to be casual interest rather than the calculated observation it truly was. He kept a few steps behind as she moved from room to room, her gentle presence bringing light wherever she went. In room 112, Eleanor sat beside an elderly man with clouded eyes. Mr. Peterson, blind for the last decade, listened with a peaceful smile as she read from a well-worn poetry book. Hope is a thing with feathers that perches in the soul, Eleanor read, her voice clear and melodic, and sings a tune without the words, and never stops at all. Mr. Peterson nodded along, his sightless eyes somehow still reflecting contentment. Emily Dickinson always understood the heart, didn't she, Eleanor? She certainly understood mine, Eleanor replied, patting his hand. Richard shifted uncomfortably in the doorway. He'd never seen this side of his mother, this woman who seemed to know exactly what each person needed. Later, Eleanor knocked softly on another door where a woman sat alone, staring at a framed photograph. Richard recognized the hollow look of fresh grief. Martha, I brought you some tea, Eleanor said, entering with a small tray. The woman looked up, tears streaming down her lined face. 47 years together, Eleanor? How do I live without him? Instead of offering empty platitudes, Eleanor simply sat beside her, shoulder to shoulder. Tell me about your favorite memory with George. As Martha spoke about a long-ago anniversary picnic, her tears continued, but her voice grew steadier. Eleanor didn't try to fix the unfixable. She simply created space for grief to breathe. Richard watched, something uncomfortable stirring in his chest. He'd rushed his own grieving when his father died, throwing himself into work, avoiding his mother's attempts to share memories. Outside in the garden, a young nurse sat alone on a bench, her head in her hands. Richard recognized her as Angela from the name tag. Her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. Eleanor approached, settling beside her. Bad day, dear? The electric company's threatening to shut off power at my apartment, Angela whispered. The daycare raised their rates again, and Tommy needs new shoes, and her voice cracked. Let's pray about it, Eleanor said simply, taking the young woman's hands in hers. Richard expected the nurse to refuse, but instead she bowed her head readily. His mother's soft words carried on the breeze, asking for provision and peace. When they finished, Eleanor said something too quiet for Richard to hear, but the nurse's face transformed with relief and gratitude. Throughout the day, Richard witnessed similar scenes, Eleanor remembering detailed stories about families she'd never met, listening to concerns both significant and trivial with equal attention, offering wisdom without judgment. And everywhere, Richard noted the way people looked at his mother with respect that went beyond her position as owner. They valued her presence, not her wealth. That night, Richard lay in his own bed, staring at the ceiling fan spinning lazy circles above him. His home felt oddly empty after the bustle of the nursing home. Sleep eluded him as images from the day replayed in his mind. The blind man who recognized Eleanor's footsteps before she spoke. The grieving widow who found momentary peace in sharing memories. The young nurse whose burdens seemed lighter after a simple prayer. Richard turned onto his side, punching his pillow into shape. He'd come to the nursing home to protect his inheritance, but instead found himself confronting uncomfortable questions. Why did these strangers treat his mother with a reverence he'd never shown her? What did they see that he had missed all these years? He closed his eyes, trying to silence the whisper of shame growing louder in his heart. Richard arrived at the nursing home earlier than usual the next morning, a folder of legal documents tucked under his arm. He spent half the night drafting what he considered reasonable arguments about family responsibility and financial prudence. The hallways were quiet, most residents still asleep or just beginning their morning routines. He found Eleanor in the small chapel, sitting alone in the front row. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, painting colorful patterns across her silver hair. Richard hesitated at the doorway, then cleared his throat. Eleanor turned, her face brightening. Richard, What a lovely surprise to see you so early. Mother, we need to talk about something important. He gestured to a private corner of the chapel. Of course, dear. She followed him, her movements unhurried. Richard pulled 2 chairs close together and sat, placing the folder on his lap. I've been thinking about your situation here. My situation? Eleanor's eyes crinkled with gentle amusement. Your financial situation. Richard opened the folder, revealing neatly organized papers. You've made some generous investments in this place, but have you considered the future, your future? Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. The Lord has blessed me with more than enough. That's exactly my point. Richard leaned forward. You've worked hard all your life, and Father left you well provided for. But charity begins at home, Mother. Family should come first. Family has always come first for me, Richard. Then you should update your will. The words tumbled out faster than he intended. Protect what's yours, what should stay in the family. This place, he gestured around them, is wonderful, but these people aren't your blood. Eleanor studied his face. Is that what this is about? The will? Richard shifted uncomfortably. It's about protecting your legacy. My son, Eleanor said softly, love is the only treasure worth inheriting. That's a nice sentiment, but it doesn't pay bills. Richard pulled out a document with highlighted sections. I've spoken with a lawyer. You could maintain partial ownership while securing the rest for family. For me, the last words hung naked in the air between them. Eleanor reached out and gently closed the folder. Richard, my legacy isn't this building or any account balance. You don't understand what I'm trying to say. I understand perfectly. Her voice remained kind but carried unexpected firmness. You're worried about money, but I'm concerned with something far more valuable. Richard's jaw tightened. So you're just gonna give everything away? Pour your life savings, dad's money into strangers? Every person here is someone's child, someone's parent. No one is a stranger in God's family. Eleanor placed her hand over his. My legacy is already decided in my heart, Richard, and it includes you in ways you cannot yet see. Heat flooded Richard's face. Ways I cannot see? Mother, I'm not a child waiting for spiritual lessons. I'm a grown man with real financial concerns. The richest man I know is Mr. Peterson down the hall, who owns nothing but gives joy to everyone he meets. Richard stood abruptly, the folder falling to the floor, papers scattering. This is pointless. You've always chosen your charity cases over your own son. That's not true, Richard. I've always... Save it. He gathered the papers with jerky movements. Keep your money. Keep your precious nursing home. Keep all of it. Richard strolled toward the door, each step heavier than the last. At the threshold, he turned back, expecting to see hurt or anger on his mother's face. Instead, Eleanor had already bowed her head, lips moving in silent prayer. The door slammed behind him, the sound echoing through the quiet hallway. Richard had avoided the nursing home for 3 days after his confrontation with Eleanor. When he finally returned, he told himself it was to check on his investment potential, not out of any sense of guilt or obligation. He chose the afternoon visiting hours, hoping to blend in with other families. Walking briskly down the west corridor, he kept his eyes forward, nodding curtly at staff who recognized him. The place was busier than usual, some kind of veterans recognition event in the main hall. Perfect. Eleanor would be occupied with her hosting duties. Jamie? Jamie? Is that you, son? Richard continued walking, not registering the wavering voice calling out behind him. Jamie, wait. A hand caught his sleeve, surprisingly strong for its age. Richard turned, prepared to correct the mistake, when he found himself face to face with an elderly man in a wheelchair. The veteran wore a navy blue cap adorned with military pins, his weathered face a map of wrinkles. But it was his eyes that stopped Richard's correction, cold, wide, watery, and filled with such desperate hope that the words died in Richard's throat. You came. The man's voice broke. After all these years, you finally came. Richard glanced around for help, for someone to redirect this confused old man. Sir, I'm not. I told them you would. The veteran reached up with trembling hands. They said you'd never forgive me, but I knew better. I knew my boy would come home. Before Richard could step back, The man pushed himself up from his wheelchair with surprising strength and wrapped his arms around Richard's waist. The veteran's body shook with silent sobs against Richard's chest. "I'm sorry for everything, son. So sorry." Richard stood frozen, his arms awkwardly at his sides. The corridor seemed to narrow, the sounds of the facility fading away. He should correct this mistake. He should call for a nurse. He should disentangle himself from this stranger. Instead, his arms slowly lifted, settling around the thin shoulders of the weeping man. It's okay," Richard whispered, the words emerging from some long-sealed chamber in his heart. The veteran clung tighter. "I miss so much. Your graduation, your wedding, the birth of my grandchildren." Richard felt something crack inside his chest, not painful, but like ice breaking on a spring river. He patted the man's back gently, the way his own father had done when Richard was small. "We have time now," Richard said, the lie feeling strangely like truth. The veteran pulled back, his face transformed with joy. He studied Richard's features with hungry eyes. "You look just like your mother." She always had that same determined expression. A nurse approached quietly. "Mr. Henderson, it's time for your medication." The spell broke. The veteran blinked, confusion returning to his eyes. "Jamie, I'll come back," Richard promised, surprised by his own sincerity. As the nurse wheeled Mr. Henderson away, Richard remained rooted to the spot, something warm and unfamiliar spreading through his chest. He hadn't felt this way since before his father died, when family still meant safety instead of obligation. A movement at the end of the hallway caught his eye. Eleanor stood watching, one hand pressed to her heart. Even from this distance, Richard could see the shimmer of tears on her cheeks and the smile that transformed her face. She made no move to approach him, simply nodded once as if confirming something she'd always known. Richard looked away first, unsettled by the hope in her eyes and by the answering echo he felt stirring in his own heart. Richard wasn't sure why he stayed for dinner. He told himself it was to observe operations, to calculate the facility's value. Yet when Eleanor spotted him lingering in the corridor after the encounter with Mr. Henderson, her invitation held no agenda he could detect. "The residents eat at 5. Would you join us?" He nodded before thinking. Now Richard sat stiffly at a round table in the dining room, surrounded by 4 elderly residents and Eleanor. The space buzzed with conversation, servers moving efficiently between tables. The food surprised him: fresh roasted chicken, vegetables that hadn't been cooked to mush, and warm rolls that filled the room with a homey scent. "And then I told the doctor, I may be old, but I'm not deaf," proclaimed Mabel, a tiny woman with a cloud of white hair and surprising volume for someone her size. The table erupted in laughter. Richard found himself chuckling along, the sound unfamiliar to his own ears. "What do you do for work, young man?" asked George, a dignified gentleman with a perfectly trimmed mustache. Richard straightened his shoulders. "I own Warren Construction, small commercial projects, mostly." "A builder," George's eyes lit up. "I was in architecture before retirement, designed half the buildings downtown." "Really? Including the Miller Building on 5th? That was one of mine," George beamed. The curved facade was revolutionary for its time. "I always admired that design." Richard leaned forward, forgetting himself. "We renovated the interior last year. The foundation was rock solid. They don't build them like that anymore." Their conversation flowed into technical details that made the others groan good-naturedly. Richard found himself gesturing with his fork, describing a challenging support beam replacement, while George nodded with professional appreciation. "You boys and your buildings," Mabel interrupted, winking at Eleanor. "Some of us have more important things to discuss, like when they're bringing dessert." Richard laughed, the sound bursting from him unexpectedly. Not his usual controlled chuckle for clients, but something genuine that seemed to come from a dusty corner of himself. "Speaking of dessert," said Ruth, a former librarian with bright eyes behind thick glasses. "Did I tell you about the time my Henry tried to surprise me with an anniversary cake?" "Only about 50 times, Mabel said, rolling her eyes. "Let the young man hear it," Ruth insisted, patting Richard's hand. "Henry was colorblind, you see. Ordered what he thought was a lovely white frosting. Turned out to be mint green. Everyone at our party looked like they were eating moldy bread." The mental image struck Richard as absurdly funny. He laughed again, shoulders relaxing, tie loosened. For a moment, he forgot about evaluations and inheritance, forgot about his struggling business and mounting debts, forgot about the resentment he'd nursed for years. A server arrived with apple crisp topped with vanilla ice cream. The conversation continued around him, comfortable and inclusive, requiring nothing of him but his presence. When had he last experienced that? This simple belonging without expectations or judgments? Eleanor caught his eye from across the table. She hadn't spoken much, content to watch him integrate with her community. The soft light from the dining room chandelier caught the silver in her hair, reminding him suddenly of how his father used to look at her. "Do you see now, Richard?" she whispered, voice barely carrying over the lively conversation. "This is family." The words hung between them, simple and profound. Richard looked down at his dessert, unable to hold her gaze or the truth in it. Richard stared at his phone in disbelief. Jim's voicemail playing for the third time. "Richard, I'm sorry. There's no easy way to say this. I filed for bankruptcy. The Westwood project went under, and I can't cover our losses. The lawyers say since we're partners, they'll be coming after your assets too. I'm sorry, man. I really am." The phone slipped from his fingers onto his kitchen table. Outside, the spring morning shone with cruel brightness, oblivious to his world collapsing. Richard's temples throbbed as he calculated the damage. The Westwood project represented nearly 60% of their current contracts. Without it, Warren Construction was finished. He stumbled to his home office, flipping through folders with trembling hands. Every financial statement confirmed what he already knew. He leveraged everything on this partnership. His house, his savings, even his retirement fund. Gone. All of it gone. A bill from his mortgage company mocked him from the desk. Second notice. He'd been planning to catch up with profits from Westwood. Richard slammed his fist against the wall. The framed photo of his father fell, glass cracking across the old man's face. He left it there, broken on the floor. His phone buzzed with texts from the bank. Automatic notifications of accounts past due. Richard grabbed his car keys, needing to move, to act, to do something before the walls closed in. Behind the wheel, his thoughts spun wildly. How had he missed the signs? Jim had seemed nervous lately, canceling meetings, avoiding details about subcontractors. Richard had been too distracted with Eleanor to notice. Eleanor, the realization hit him like a physical blow. While he faced financial ruin, his mother sat on a fortune. The nursing home property alone was worth millions in the growing suburb. And what was she doing with it? Giving it away to strangers while her own son drowned. Traffic lights blurred as he drove faster than he should. All those years supporting her after Dad died. Taking her in when she claimed she couldn't manage alone. Listening to her gentle lectures about faith and patience. And all along, she'd been hiding her wealth, watching him struggle. Yesterday's warm feelings from dinner evaporated like morning dew. Family? What kind of mother watched her son work himself to exhaustion while sitting on a gold mine? The nursing home parking lot was half full when he arrived. Richard barely remembered to lock his car before storming through the automatic doors. The receptionist called out a greeting, but he brushed past without acknowledging her. Residents in the hallway flattened themselves against walls as he passed. His footsteps echoed like gunshots on the polished floor. A nurse stepped forward with a concerned expression. "Mr. Warren? Is everything? Where's my mother?" The words came out as a growl. "Mrs. Warren is in her room, but she's resting." Richard was already moving again, taking the corner so fast his shoulders slammed into the wall. Room 117. The door was partially open, soft music floating out. He pushed it wide, the door banging against the wall. Eleanor sat in her armchair by the window, Bible open on her lap. Sunlight framed her silver hair like a halo, adding cruel irony to the moment. She looked up, surprise melting into concern when she saw his face. "Richard, what's happened?" He stepped into the room, hands clenched at his sides, voice shaking with barely controlled fury. It's all been you." Eleanor's Bible slipped from her lap as she stood, reaching toward her son. His face was flushed, eyes wild with an anger she hadn't seen since he was a teenager. "Richard, please sit down. Whatever's troubling you." "My business is ruined," Richard spat the words. "Everything I've built, gone. And here you are, surrounded by your empire, playing the humble saint. Understanding dawned in Eleanor's eyes. Your partnership with Jim, don't pretend you care now. Richard paced the small room like a caged animal. All these years, you've watched me struggle, scrape, and sacrifice. You sat at my table, eating my food, while hiding millions. Eleanor's shoulders straightened despite her frail frame. I never hid anything from you, Richard. You never asked. Because I thought you needed me. His voice cracked. I thought I was taking care of you, and you were laughing behind my back. No, Eleanor's voice remained steady. I was praying for you every day. Richard grabbed a framed photo from her nightstand him as a child with his father. Prayers don't pay mortgages. Dad will be ashamed of you, hoarding his money while your son loses everything. Pain flashed across Eleanor's face. Your father understood what wealth was for. To share with family, not strangers. To serve others, she corrected gently. Richard, this building isn't my possession, it's my purpose. Richard slammed the photo down. And what about my purpose, my needs? What you need isn't money. Eleanor stepped closer, her eyes searching his. When Thomas mistakes you for his son, when Martha shares her cookies with you, when you laughed at dinner yesterday, that was the real Richard, the boy I raised. Stop it. Richard stepped back. I don't need your psychological analysis. I need you to be a mother for once. Eleanor flinched as if struck. A mother for once? If you loved me, you'd help me now when I need it most. Richard's voice dropped dangerously. But you rather play guardian angel to strangers. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained firm. Love isn't measured in dollars and cents, Richard. It never has been. Easy words from someone who has both. What I have can't be bought or sold. Eleanor reached for his hand, but he jerked away. This anger isn't you, Richard. It's fear speaking. Don't you dare psychoanalyze me. His shout echoed off the walls. You know what? Keep your money. Keep your precious mission. You chose these people over your own son. I've never chosen anyone over you. Lies. Richard knocked a vase of flowers from the dresser. Water and daisies scattered across the floor. For years, I've carried the burden of being your son. No more. Eleanor's tears fell freely now. Richard, please. I'm done. He backed toward the door. Do you hear me? Done. Give everything to your real family. I never want to see you again. Son, I am not your son anymore. The words hung in the air between them, impossible to take back. Eleanor stood perfectly still, one hand pressed to her heart. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant sounds of the facility beyond the door. Richard turned and stormed out. The door slammed behind him with such force that a painting fell from the wall, the frame cracking on impact. In the empty room, Eleanor slowly knelt beside the scattered flowers, gathering them with trembling hands. The house felt different now, empty, despite the piles of papers scattered across every surface, each one a declaration of Richard's failure. He hadn't bothered to turn on the lights when he got home. The darkness suited his mood better. Richard slumped at his kitchen table, the same spot where Eleanor had sat just weeks ago, offering him buttered toast and gentle wisdom. He pushed the memory away and reached for the bottle of whiskey he picked up on the drive home. A foreclosure notice glowed white in the moonlight streaming through the window. He'd ignored the warnings, convinced his business would turn around. Now the bank wanted his house in 30 days. To my empire, Richard mumbled, raising the bottle in mock toast before taking a swig. The liquor burned going down, but not enough to erase the look on his mother's face when he slammed the door. The clock on the microwave blinked 1:37 a.m. His cell phone lay silent beside him, its battery nearly dead, much like his career, his savings, his pride. 3 voice messages from his lawyer remained unanswered. What was the point? There was nothing left to save. Richard picked up an unpaid electric bill and crumpled it in his fist. His mother's voice echoed in his head. Love isn't measured in dollars and cents. Easy for you to say, he snapped at the empty kitchen. The silence that answered made his chest ache in a way the whiskey couldn't touch. He'd never spent a night in this house completely alone before. Even when Eleanor moved in after his father died, bringing her small suitcase and endless faith, Richard had resented her presence. Now her absence felt like an accusation. The foreclosure notice slipped from the table and joined others on the floor. Credit card bills, collection notices, A letter from Jim explaining why he declared bankruptcy without warning. Richard didn't bother picking them up. Soon none of this will be his problem. Soon nothing will be his at all. A photograph caught his eye, half buried under the bills. Richard pulled it out, a faded Polaroid of his parents on their 20th anniversary. His father looked proud in his Sunday suit, arm wrapped around Eleanor. Richard had taken the picture himself as a teenager. He'd forgotten he still had it. His father had died 3 months later. Heart attack at 52. The memory of Eleanor's strength during that time crashed through Richard's alcohol-numbed mind. She'd grieved deeply but never complained, even when they had to downsize. She'd put Richard through college with what little insurance money came through, and now he'd thrown her kindness back in her face. She could have told me, Richard whispered, tracing his father's face in the photograph. But had he ever given her the chance? Had he ever asked about her life, her dreams, her plans for the future? The heat of shame spread up his neck. The house creaked around him, settling into the night, a sound like judgment. He thought of the veteran who'd hugged him, mistaking him for his son. The brief, unexpected warmth he'd felt at the dinner table with the resident, the way his mother watched him with hope when he laughed. What have I done? Richard's voice cracked in the darkness. The pile of bills offered no answer. The empty house stood silent witness to his ruin, not just financial, but moral. He lost more than money today. He'd thrown away the one person who never stopped believing in him. Richard covered his face with his hands, shoulders shaking, surrounded by the paper evidence of his failures, alone in the darkening shadows of what would soon no longer be his home. The bank representative didn't meet his eyes. She'd been polite but firm. He had until the end of the day to collect his personal belongings. The locks would be changed tomorrow morning. Richard stood in his bedroom, a duffel bag open on the stripped mattress. What did the man take when his life collapsed? He grabbed a few shirts, pants, underwear. His hand lingered over the photo of his parents before sliding it between folded clothes. The rest, furniture, kitchenware, the television he'd spent too much money on, would be sold at auction. 15 years in this house, and his life fit into one bag. His phone rang. The caller ID showed his lawyer. Richard, I've been trying to reach you for days. I'm leaving the house now. It's over. Richard's voice sounded hollow even to himself. Look, I might be able to arrange a short-term rental through a friend. It's not much, but no. Richard cut him off. I appreciate it, but I need to handle this myself. After hanging up, Richard stood in the empty living room. Rectangles of brighter paint marked where pictures had hung. One square showed where Eleanor's cross-stitch had decorated the wall, the one that read, "Bless this home." He'd taken it down the day after she left. The irony wasn't lost on him. Richard locked the front door for the last time and slid the key through the mail slot. The sound echoed with finality. His car, 3 months behind on payment, wouldn't be his much longer either. But for now, it was transportation and potential shelter. He placed the duffel bag on the passenger seat and pulled away without looking back. For hours, Richard drove without destination, past strip malls and office parks, through neighborhoods where families sat down to dinner. The gas gauge dipped toward empty. A sunset painted the sky in mocking shades of gold. At the red light, he noticed an elderly couple crossing the street. The man held his wife's elbow, guiding her with gentle care. Richard watched them until the light changed and someone honked behind him. His mother's face appeared in his mind, not angry as he'd last seen her, but patient, waiting. She'd always been waiting for him to understand what mattered. I've been such a fool, he whispered. Richard checked his wallet. $23 and a maxed out credit card. Not enough for a hotel, not enough for anything. Almost without conscious decision, he found himself turning onto Cedar Lane, the road that led to Cedar's retirement community, his mother's building. The place he'd abandoned her, the place she'd built to shelter others. The nursing home stood against the darkening sky, windows glowing with warm light. Richard parked across the street, engine idling. Through the large front windows, he could see residents gathered in the common room. Someone was playing piano. A nurse pushed a wheelchair past the window, pausing to adjust the elderly man's blanket. Was his mother in there? Would she even speak to him after what he'd said? Richard turned off the engine. The silence pressed against him. He gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white with tension. He had nowhere else to go. No one else who might, despite everything, still care whether he lived or died. But the weight of his actions, the terrible things he said, kept him frozen in his seat. Darkness settled around the car. Richard stared at the nursing home's entrance, a war waging inside him between desperate need and crushing shame. The building beckoned with its promise of warmth, while his guilt whispered that he deserved the cold. An autumn breeze cut through Richard's thin jacket, forcing his hand. He stepped out of the car, legs stiff from hours of driving. The duffel bag felt heavier than it should as he slung it over his shoulder. Each step toward the entrance seemed to take forever. Memories flashed through his mind, his angry words, the hurt in his mother's eyes, the door slamming behind him as he stormed out. The weight of it all threatened to drive him to his knees before he even reached the door. The automatic door slid open with a gentle whoosh. Warm air embraced him, along with a faint scent of cinnamon and furniture polish. The lobby was quiet now. A young woman at the reception desk looked up, her name tag reading Sophia. "Can I help you?" she asked. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came. How could he explain? What would he even say? "I'm here to see Eleanor Warren." He finally managed. Recognition dawned in Sophia's eyes. "Mr. Warren? Mrs. Warren's son?" He nodded, shame burning his cheeks. "One moment." She picked up the phone, speaking quietly. Richard shifted his weight, fighting the urge to flee back into the night. A door opened down the hall. Richard's breath caught in his throat. Eleanor appeared, dressed in a simple blue cardigan and slacks. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, just as it always had been. She moved slowly but with purpose, her eyes finding his across the lobby. Time stopped. Richard saw the moment she registered his appearance, the rumpled clothes, the circles under his eyes, the defeated slump of his shoulders, the bag that held everything he now owned in the world. He expected judgment, disappointment, perhaps even satisfaction that his pride had finally brought him low. Instead, Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Not tears of anger or hurt, but of relief. "Richard," she whispered, her voice carrying across the quiet lobby. "Mom, His voice broke. He couldn't finish. Eleanor crossed the space between them with small, hurried steps. Without hesitation, she wrapped her arms around him, her small frame pressing against his chest. She smelled like lavender and home. "My boy," she murmured against his shoulder. "My precious boy." Something cracked inside Richard. The wall he'd built, the bitterness he'd nursed, the pride that had driven him to this moment, it all came tumbling down. "I'm sorry," he choked out. "I'm so sorry." Eleanor pulled back just enough to look into his face. Her hands, wrinkled and spotted with age, reached up to cup his cheeks. Thumbs gently wiped away tears he hadn't realized were falling. "You are here now," she said simply. "That's what matters." The kindness in her voice undid him completely. Richard's knees buckled. Eleanor caught him as best she could, guiding him to a nearby bench. She sat beside him, arm around his shoulders, holding him as she had when he was a child waking from nightmares. "The house is gone," Richard whispered. "The business, my savings, everything. I have nowhere to go." Eleanor's hand smoothed his hair, her touch infinitely gentle. "You've come home," she corrected him softly. Richard turned his face into his mother's shoulder, his body shaking with silent sobs. "I've lost everything," he whispered, voice raw with despair. Eleanor held him tighter, rocking slightly, her love surrounding him like a fortress against the darkness. Eleanor led Richard down the hallway, past rooms filled with residents settling in for the evening. She walked with quiet dignity, nodding to staff members who offered respectful smiles. Richard followed a step behind, clutching his duffel bag like a shield. "It's not much," Eleanor said, stopping at a door near the end of the east wing. "But it's clean and quiet." She opened the door to reveal a modest room with a single bed, a small dresser, and a chair by the window. Simple curtains framed the view of the garden, now silver in the moonlight. A small bathroom adjoined the space. "This is where new staff sometimes stay," she explained. "But it's yours for as long as you need it." Richard stepped inside, overwhelmed by the simplicity. It was smaller than his master bathroom had been, yet somehow felt more welcoming than his entire house had in years. "I can't just stay here for free," he said. his voice still rough from crying. Eleanor touched his arm gently. No one stays here for free, Richard. Everyone contributes what they can. She left him to settle in, promising to check on him in the morning. Richard unpacked his meager belongings, 3 shirts, 2 pairs of pants, underwear, toiletries. His wallet with $17 inside. A photo of his father he'd grabbed on impulse before leaving the house forever. He slept fitfully that first night, waking several times to the unfamiliar sounds of the nursing home, soft footsteps in the hallway, the distant hum of the night nurse's cart, the gentle whir of the heating system. At dawn, Richard dressed in his cleanest shirt and ventured out. In the dining hall, breakfast preparation was underway. An older man with stooped shoulders struggled to push a cart of clean dishes. Without thinking, Richard stepped forward. "Let me help with that." The man looked up in surprise, then smiled. "Much obliged. These old bones don't work like they used to." Richard took over, wheeling the heavy cart to the kitchen. The staff looked at him curiously, but no one questioned his presence. After breakfast, Richard found himself following a young janitor named Miguel, who was sweeping the halls. "You need another broom?" Richard asked. Miguel hesitated, then handed him the spare. "Start at the far end, work your way back." The morning passed in a blur of simple tasks. Richard swept floors until his palms blistered. He carried lunch trays to residents who couldn't make it to the dining hall. He folded warm sheets from the laundry, their clean scent reminding him of childhood. No one asked who he was or why he was there. No one mentioned his mother's ownership of the building. He was just another pair of hands, useful for the work that needed doing. By evening, his back ached and his feet throbbed. His hands were raw from unaccustomed labor. Yet as he helped serve dinner, Richard caught his mother watching him from across the room, her eyes shining with something he couldn't name. When the day's work was done, Richard returned to his small room. He showered, the hot water easing his tired muscles. Dressed in his last clean t-shirt, he sat in the chair by the window and looked out at the stars appearing one by one in the darkening sky. For the first time in years, his mind wasn't racing, with deals to close, competitors to beat, appearances to maintain. The constant pressure that had lived in his chest to succeed, to acquire, to prove himself, had quieted to a whisper. He took a deep breath and was surprised to find he could fill his lungs completely. The air seemed sweeter somehow. Richard leaned back in the chair, watching the moon rise over the garden. He felt lighter, as if he set down a burden he hadn't known he was carrying. Richard developed a routine in the days that followed. Mornings meant helping serve breakfast, afternoons were for maintenance tasks, and evenings he spent in the community spaces, initially just to avoid the loneliness of his small room. On his second week, he noticed an elderly man sitting alone at a chess table, moving pieces against himself. Richard recognized him as the veteran who had embraced him that day, mistaking him for his son. "Mind if I join you?" Richard asked, approaching cautiously. The man looked up, recognition flickering across his weathered face. "You're not my boy." "No, sir, I'm not. I'm Richard. Walter Thompson, served in Korea." The old man gestured to the empty chair. "You play?" Richard sat down. "My father taught me. Haven't played in years." Walter reset the board with trembling hands. Richard noticed the military precision in the placement of each piece. "Your move, son." Richard moved a pawn, and soon they were engrossed in the game. Walter played with surprising strategy, capturing Richard's bishop early. "Got to protect your flanks," Walter advised, tapping the board. "Enemy comes from where you least expect." They played 3 games that afternoon. Richard lost all 3. "Tomorrow?" Walter asked as they put the pieces away. "Yes, I'll be here." Their daily chess matches became a fixture. Walter never again mistook Richard for his son, but sometimes he'd share stories of his boy who had moved across the country 20 years ago and rarely called. "He's busy," Walter would say. "Important job." Richard would nod, the words cutting deep. In the television room, Richard met Edith Miller, a widow with photos of her grandchildren taped all around her wheelchair. One afternoon, he helped her sort through old photo albums. "That's Robert, my husband," she said, pointing to a handsome man in uniform. "Married 56 years before his heart gave out." Richard looked at the photos of their life together, children's birthdays, anniversaries, family vacations, at a small lake cabin. "You were happy," he he said, surprised at the envy in his voice. We were poor as church mice most years, Edith laughed, but rich in what mattered. Richard found himself returning to hear more of Edith's stories. Her life, ordinary by any measure, seemed filled with a wealth he couldn't name. When Albert Gaines complained about his broken radio, Richard spent the evening taking it apart on the activity room table. His hands, once used only for signing contracts and shaking on deals, now worked with tiny screwdrivers and wires. Fixed, he announced, plugging it in. The sounds of a jazz station filled the room. Albert's face lit up. That's Glenn Miller. My Josephine and I danced to this at our wedding. Soon, Richard had a waiting list of small repairs, a stuck drawer, a loose chair leg, a clock that ran slow, problems with simple solutions, unlike the mess he'd made of his life. Eleanor watched it all from a distance. She saw Richard patiently teaching a resident how to use the computer in the library, observed him helping Walter down the hallway when his arthritis flared, noticed how he remembered everyone's names, preferences, and stories. One evening, she stood in the doorway of the community room, watching Richard laugh at Albert's joke, his head thrown back in genuine amusement. The sound so rare in recent years made her heart swell. Eleanor slipped away unnoticed to the small chapel. She knelt carefully, her knees protesting the movement, and clasped her hands. Thank you, she whispered, tears of gratitude filling her eyes. You heard my prayers. My son is finding his way home. Richard knocked hesitantly on the director's door one morning, a folder tucked under his arm. Coming, called Director Michaels, glancing up from her cluttered desk. Oh, Richard, what can I do for you? Richard shifted his weight from one foot to the other. I noticed you seemed overwhelmed with the quarterly reports yesterday. I used to run a business, and I thought, he extended the folder, maybe I could help. Director Michaels' eyebrows rose as she flipped through Richard's notes. Her surprised expression gradually transformed into one of appreciation. These are excellent observations, she said. I've been so buried in paperwork, I couldn't see the forest for the trees. She gestured to a chair. Please, sit down. I'd love to hear more. Richard settled across from her, pointing to a spreadsheet. Your vendor contracts could be consolidated. You're paying 3 different companies for maintenance when one could handle it all at a reduced rate. That will free up funds for resident care. She nodded, making notes. For the next hour, they pored over budgets and schedules. Richard felt a forgotten energy flow through him. This wasn't about profit margins or beating competitors. It was about making limited resources stretch further for people who needed them. The charity wing expansion, Richard said, tapping a blueprint. Materials costs have skyrocketed since these estimates, but I know contractors who might donate labor if we approach them right. Director Michael studied him curiously. Your mother never mentioned your business acumen. Richard's cheeks warmed. We haven't exactly been close in recent years. Well, we could use someone with your skills. Would you consider taking on an official role here? Nothing fancy, but meaningful work. Richard blinked in surprise. You trust me with that? Eleanor trusts you, she said simply. That's good enough for me. The following days found Richard in a small office adjacent to the director's, sleeves rolled up, reorganizing filing systems and creating spreadsheets. He discovered the facility operated on a surprisingly tight budget, with Eleanor reinvesting most profits into improvements, and the charity wing that housed seniors with nowhere else to go. One afternoon, Eleanor appeared in his doorway with tea. You missed lunch, she said, placing the mug beside him. Richard looked up from a jumble of invoices. Did you know the pharmaceutical supplier has been overcharging us for 2 years? Eleanor smiled. Is that so? I've negotiated a refund and a discount going forward. He took a sip of tea. That's another $30,000 for the charity wing. Eleanor settled into the chair across from him, watching him work. The harsh lines of stress that had marked his face for years had softened. There was purpose in his movements now. We're expanding the physical therapy room, Richard continued, showing her the revised plans. It'll cost less than the original estimate and serve twice as many residents. Eleanor reached across the desk and covered his hand with hers. Your father would be so proud of you. Richard swallowed hard. I doubt that. He always said you had a brilliant mind for business. He just hoped you'd find the right purpose for it. Her eyes crinkled with emotion. And now you have. Later that evening, Richard joined Eleanor for the residence council meeting. She stood before the group, outlining improvements planned for the coming month. And my son, Richard, my partner in this ministry, Eleanor said, gesturing toward him, her eyes shining with unmistakable pride, has found ways to make our dreams for this place come true even sooner than we hoped. Partner. The word wrapped around Richard's heart like a warm embrace. Not heir, not beneficiary, partner in something that mattered. The nursing home chapel filled with residents that Sunday morning. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across wrinkled faces and gray heads. Richard sat in the back row, fidgeting with his collar. He hadn't attended a church service in years, not since his father's funeral. Eleanor sat in the front, her Bible open on her lap. She wore a simple blue dress with a white cardigan, her silver hair neatly pinned back. From his position, Richard could see only her profile, but he noticed how she nodded at the chaplain's words, occasionally marking passages with her finger. The chaplain, a gentle-voiced man with kind eyes, spoke about forgiveness and second chances. His words hung in the air, wrapping around Richard like a question, waiting for an answer. Before we close, the chaplain said, "Would anyone like to share a testimony or prayer request?" The room fell silent. Richard's heart hammered in his chest. Before he could reconsider, he rose to his feet. Every head turned toward him. Eleanor looked back, surprise evident in her widened eyes. "I'd like to say something," Richard said, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat and stepped into the center aisle. The wooden floor creaked beneath his feet as he walked toward the front. Standing beside the chaplain, Richard faced the congregation of elderly residents, nurses, and staff members. "Many of you know me as Eleanor Warren's son." He glanced at his mother, whose hands were clasped tightly in her lap. "But what you may not know is that I abandoned her when she needed me most." A few residents exchanged glances. Others nodded knowingly. "I brought her here thinking I was getting rid of a burden." His voice caught. "I was blind to what truly matters. While I chased money and status, my mother quietly built something beautiful, something that lasts." The veteran who had once mistaken Richard for his son wiped a tear from his weathered cheek. "When I lost everything, my business, my home, my pride, she welcomed me back without question, without judgment." Richard swallowed hard. "My mother taught me that love isn't something you earn. It's something you give, especially when it costs you everything." He turned toward Eleanor, whose eyes shimmered with tears. "Mom, I want to thank you publicly for never giving up on me, for showing me what real wealth looks like." His voice broke. "It looks like this room full of people who care for each other. It looks like second chances and open arms." Eleanor pressed her handkerchief to her lips, shoulders trembling slightly. "I spent years running from your lessons," Richard continued. "I thought success meant having more than others. You showed me it means giving more than others." The chapel remained hushed, but the silence held a reverent quality. "Thank you," Richard finished simply, "for loving me enough to let me find my way back home." Soft applause rippled through the room. The blind woman Richard often read to dabbed at her eyes. The widow who shared her late husband's stories with him nodded approvingly. The young nurse who had once confided her financial troubles to Eleanor smiled through her tears. When the service ended, residents approached Richard one by one, squeezing his hand or patting his shoulder. Some shared stories of Eleanor's kindness. Others simply thanked him for his honesty. Eleanor waited until everyone had filed out before approaching her son. She took both his hands in hers, her eyes luminous with unshed tears. "Richard," she whispered, her voice tender with emotion, "this is all I ever wanted." Richard moved with purpose through the recreation hall, directing volunteers with a wave of his hand. 3 months had passed since his public confession in the chapel, and the nursing home had become more than a refuge. It had become his purpose. "The streamers need to be higher on that corner," he called to Mark, the maintenance man who balanced on the ladder. "Mom always loves blue. Make sure those ones stand out." "You got it, boss," Mark replied with a grin, adjusting the decorations. Blue and silver balloons clustered against the ceiling. A hand-painted banner proclaimed, "Happy 75th birthday, Eleanor," in careful brushstrokes, the work of the art therapy group. Richard checked his watch. 2 hours until the surprise celebration. In the kitchen, he sampled the cake frosting with an approving nod to the cook. "Perfect," Not too sweet, just like she likes it. You sure know your mother well, the cook said, continuing to pipe delicate flowers around the cake's edge. Richard paused, a wistfulness crossing his face. I'm still learning, making up for lost time. He moved on to inspect the gift table where residents had placed their handmade cards and small tokens of appreciation. Mr. Jenkins, the veteran who had once mistaken Richard for his son, had carved a delicate wooden rose. Mrs. Patterson had knitted a soft lavender shawl. Each gift represented a life Eleanor had touched. Richard's own gift sat in his pocket, a small velvet box containing the pocket watch that had belonged to his father. He had found it while clearing out his foreclosed home, had it repaired, and engraved with the words, "Love is the only treasure worth inheriting." At precisely 4 o'clock, Richard escorted Eleanor down the hallway. "Richard, where are we going in such a hurry?" she asked. Her steps measured but steady. "Just a small meeting about the new garden project," he fibbed, guiding her toward the recreation hall doors. When they entered, a chorus of surprise erupted from the gathered residents and staff. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth, eyes widening as she took in the decorated space and smiling faces. "Oh my goodness," she whispered. Richard led her to a chair decorated with blue ribbons. The residents surrounded her, some in wheelchairs, others leaning on walkers, all beaming with genuine affection. After cake was served and gifts opened, Richard tapped a spoon against his glass. The room quieted. "I'd like to say a few words," he began, standing tall beside his mother's chair. 75 years ago today, a woman was born who would change countless lives with her quiet strength and boundless heart. Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes moist. "I spent most of my life misunderstanding what my mother tried to teach me," Richard continued. "I thought success was measured in bank accounts and business deals. But Mom knew better. She measured it in moments of kindness, in healing wounds, in building bridges." He removed the small box from his pocket. "Mom taught me that true wealth isn't what you have, it's what you give away." He opened the box, revealing the gleaming pocket watch. This was Dad's. I had it fixed and added something I hope captures what I finally learned. Eleanor read the inscription, tears spilling onto her cheeks. "Love is the only treasure worth inheriting," she whispered. Richard knelt beside her chair. "I finally understand what you've been trying to tell me all these years." The residents began a spontaneous rendition of Happy Birthday, their wavering voices filling the room with simple joy. Eleanor stood, opening her arms to her son. Richard enfolded her in a gentle embrace, feeling her slight frame against his chest. When they pulled apart, her face was radiant. Years of worry melted away. "This," she said, gesturing to the room full of their makeshift family, "is everything I ever prayed for." As the birthday celebration continued, Eleanor moved among her friends, graciously accepting hugs and well wishes. Richard watched her from across the room, struck by how his mother seemed to glow with contentment. The sharp edges of his past bitterness had softened completely now, worn smooth by months of humility and service. Mr. Jenkins approached Richard, tapping his cane lightly on the floor. "Your mother is some woman," he said, nodding toward Eleanor. "She is," Richard agreed. "I just wish I'd seen it sooner." "Better late than never, son. Some folks never get the chance to make things right." The old veteran's eyes grew distant for a moment, no doubt thinking of his own son who had never returned. Richard placed a gentle hand on the man's shoulder. "Thank you for helping me see what matters," Richard said. "All of you did." Across the room, Eleanor laughed at something. Mrs. Patterson said, the sound pure and unrestrained. Richard couldn't remember the last time he'd heard his mother laugh like that before coming here. Perhaps it had been years he wasted wrapped up in his own pride and ambition. The facility director sidled up beside Richard, clipboard in hand. "The expansion plans for the East Wing are ready whenever you want to review them," she said. "Your ideas for the community garden are brilliant. The residents can't wait." "Let's talk tomorrow," Richard replied. "Today is just for celebrating." The director smiled knowingly. "You've changed this place, you know. Both of you have." Richard shook his head. "This place changed me." A volunteer began playing the piano in the corner, a gentle melody that rippled through the room. Several residents swayed to the music. Others tapped their feet. Eleanor caught Richard's eye from across the room and beckoned him over. "Dance with your mother on her birthday?" she asked, extending her hand. Richard took it with a smile. I'd be honored. They moved slowly in a small circle, other residents making space for them. Eleanor's steps were careful but determined, her hand resting lightly in her son's. I'm so proud of you, Richard, she said quietly. Proud of me? After everything I did? Eleanor nodded. The measure of a person isn't in never falling, but in how they rise after the fall. Richard felt a lump form in his throat. I had a good teacher. We all need second chances, she said. God gives them freely. We just need to be humble enough to accept them. As the song ended, residents applauded. Someone called for a speech from Eleanor, and others joined in the request. With a shy smile, she stood in the center of the room, her son beside her. Thank you all for making this birthday so special, she began. When I invested in this place years ago, I never imagined it would give back to me tenfold. I thought I was building a home for others, but you've become my family too. She reached for Richard's hand, squeezing it tightly, and my son has come home to me in more ways than one. The room filled with warm applause, some residents wiping away tears. Richard and Eleanor stood together, surrounded by a circle of smiling faces, some wrinkled with age, others young with staff members, all united in this moment of genuine connection. Eleanor leaned against her son's arm, her face peaceful. Richard had found what his pride and greed had always prevented him from seeing, that wealth measured in love was the only fortune worth having, and it had been offered to him freely all along. If you enjoy the story of Eleanor Warren, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.